A pale sun lifted slow over the ridges, its light spilling soft gold across the snow-tipped mountains. The world there moved in silence, save for the groan of pines in the wind and the crackle of a frozen stream beneath the ice. At the far edge of that wilderness, smoke curled from the chimney of a lonely cabin, thin, wavering, like a man's last prayer. Inside lived Elias Boone, a figure the townfolk had all but forgotten, though they spoke his name with fear or pity when winter nights grew long. His beard fell heavy against his chest, his hands were cracked as old bark, and his eyes, though hollow from solitude, still held a gentleness, the kind a man cannot unlearn, even after 10 years without a woman's voice in his home. Far below, in the narrow streets of Larkspur, a woman carried her own silence. Clara Rosewell, widowed at 23, bore the kind of grief that townspeople sharpened into whispers. Once, she had walked those streets with her husband, her hand tucked warm in his. Now she walked alone, the young men glancing away, the matrons tugging children to the other side of the road. Cursed, they said in low tones, a barren bride who brings death to her bed. Every step she took was beneath the weight of judgment, every glance a nail in her coffin. One late afternoon, with the wind knifing through the alleys and her shame heavier than the satchel she carried, Clara chose the only road left to her, the one that led away. She left the town without looking back, her boots striking hard dirt, her shawl flapping like a tattered flag of surrender. The mountain pass loomed ahead, sharp against a storm-colored sky. Snow gathered thick in the ridges, and when her horse startled and fled, leaving the wagon wheel cracked against a stone, Clara pressed on by foot. The night came with its teeth bared. Her breath thickened into frost, her body quaked, and she stumbled through drifts until her eyes caught a thread of smoke rising against the black. The cabin door opened under her trembling hand. A fire glowed inside, and there, by its light, stood Elias Boone. Their eyes met like flint against stone. No words, only the startled recognition of one exile meeting another. He moved slow, as if afraid his voice might break her. She collapsed near the hearth, the blaze thawing her fingers, the sting almost unbearable. He set a wooden bowl in her hands, stew steaming, and watched as she lifted spoon to lips, each bite undoing a knot of hunger inside her. His silence was not cruel, not laced with judgment. It was the silence of a man who had forgotten how to fill the air with sound, but remembered how to give. In the days that followed, their lives crossed like hesitant rivers. She stitched the tear in his coat with thread from her satchel. He laid fresh logs at her feet, firelight painting shadows across the carved figures on his cabin walls. Birds, women, trees, shapes he had carved to fill the emptiness. When he spoke, his voice cracked like an old hinge. She did not laugh. She only listened. But words carried faster than wine down in Larkspur. The townsfolk discovered Clara had not vanished into the earth, but into the arms of the mountain hermit. Men spat tobacco in the dirt, declaring her shame complete. The sheriff, his badge catching lamplight, swore he'd drag her back before disgrace could poison the valley. One night, with thunder rolling across the peaks, Clara spoke into the fire, her eyes wet but fierce. "They buried me long before my husband died," she whispered. "They'll never let me live." Elias looked at her, long and steady, and for the first time in a decade his hands closed over another's. His voice was low, rough as stone ground against stone. "Then stay dead to them," he said. "Live here instead." The storm shook the rafters. Their breath mingled in the heat of the hearth, and for a moment the world held still, as if waiting for their answer. In that silence, two lost souls leaned close to the embers of something new, the promise of a life the town could not take from them. Morning broke softer after the storm, the mountains washed clean with light. Clara woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood outside, each strike steady as a heartbeat. She wrapped Elias's rough-spun coat around her shoulders and stepped into the snow-bright clearing. He paused when he saw her, his breath rising in clouds, his hands dark with sap. She brushed the frost from his hair without a word, and he lowered the axe, as though the weight he carried was no longer his alone. So began their new rhythm. Elias hunted through the high pines, his rifle echoing faintly across the ridges, while Clara tended the hearth, patched the walls, and folded fresh quilts from scraps she carried with her. When he returned, she set his kiln to stew, and when the stew boiled, he pulled her chair close to the fire. In those quiet days, affection lived in gestures, her mending his torn boots, him smoothing snow from her skirts before she entered the cabin. One night, as flames curled high in the stove, Elias's voice broke through the long hush. He spoke of the woman he once loved, his wife, how she had died birthing their only child, how grief had driven him into the wilderness. 10 years had passed since he had touched a woman's hand. Clara did not pity him. Instead, she laid her palm gently over his, and in that stillness, their grief braided into something whole. Word from Larkspur climbed the mountain on horseback. The sheriff and 3 townsmen came riding, their voices sharp against the trees. "Clara Rosewell," they called, "you've been bewitched. Come down before you lose what little name you have left." Elias stood with his rifle slung across his arm, his shoulders set like stone. But Clara, heart pounding, stepped from the doorway before he could speak. The men sneered, accusing him of holding her captive. She lifted her chin, voice steady. "I chose to be here." For a moment, even Sheriff faltered. Then came the laughter, coarse and cruel. They promised hunger and winter would drive her crawling back. When their hoofbeats faded, the silence between Clara and Elias was stronger than the threats left behind. Not long after, Elias placed 2 rings carved from pine into her hand. "I have no preacher, no pews," he murmured, "but I have this." At dawn, they stood together in the clearing. Snow glistened like crushed glass beneath their boots. Birds shifted on frosted branches, and the smoke from the cabin rose like incense. With no witness but the sky, Elias vowed what he thought he would never vow again, and Clara answered by pressing her forehead against his, her breath trembling with the weight of beginning. When they kissed, it was not fever or hunger, but the breaking of a decade's silence. Yet gossip swelled like a river below. "The cursed bride has wed the wild man," townsfolk muttered, and soon merchants refused Elias's coin. When supplies dwindled, hunger gnawed at their table. Clara, weary of being hunted by whispers, resolved to face them herself. She wrapped her shawl, walked into Larkspur with head unbowed, and placed her late husband's locket on a trader's counter. "Grain and cloth," she said, "nothing more." The room fell quiet. People watched, some with pity, others with a new kind of respect, unsettled by her calm. She left carrying flour and beans, her back straight, her shame left behind in the dust. When Elias saw her return, her arms full, he fell to his knees in the snow. "You've given me back the world, Clara," he whispered, tears carving lines through the frost in his beard. She lifted him gently, and together they carried the burden inside, not as exiles, but as a family newly born. Seasons turned. Snow thawed into wildflowers that leaned toward their cabin walls. Children's laughter, whether from their own or from those they gathered in kindness, rose faint and sweet across the meadow. The cabin no longer stood as a grave for Elias's sorrow, but as a home warmed by Clara's defiance and grace. And if you find yourself shunned, bent low beneath the weight of judgment, remember this story. 2 souls thought themselves buried, yet they chose to bloom instead. The world may carve your name in stone, but it does not get to decide when your life is over. Only you can do that. And sometimes, if you are brave enough to stand in your truth, the mountains themselves will rise to shelter you.